Are you a lover of fantasy movies or TV series such as Game of Thrones, or even a Dungeons and Dragons player? Then if so, this is the cake for you. My name's Abby and I'm going to show you how you can make this amazing dragon. Here's what we'll be learning today. Let's get started. First off, there are a few things you need to think about ahead of time for this cake. They are the sugar ice that we're going to put around the edge of the cake at the end, and the horns, because they need to be left for quite a while to dry, preferably a day or so. I'm just going to talk to you about this sugar ice at the moment. It's made out of white clear mints, the glacé mints you can buy in a packet. All I've done is taken them out of the cases, put them on a baking tray and popped them in the oven for about 10 minutes at about 160, 170 degrees. Check them at about 5 minutes. You don't want them to burn. And then take them out and they'll pretty much melt straight down to this, and then you can leave that to cool. Do be very careful because it will be incredibly hot. I'm going to put this to the side now and we'll look at that again later when we come to breaking it into shards. As for the horns, we're going to need to make quite a few of these ahead of time because they really do need to dry. You're going to need 2 large ones for the tops of your head, 2 slightly smaller ones for the side, and then several little ones to fill up the space in between. If I show you how I've done that. I've got here some modelling paste in white. Give it a good knead. Okay, and I'm just going to roll it into a sort of a tapered sausage. So we want one end quite fine, like this. Once you've done one, it's much easier to match the other one up. You've got one to compare it to then. You need to make sure when you do these that you do them sort of the opposite directions, because they're both going to come out the sides of the head. So you want them kind of mirroring each other. Okay, and I've got here some wooden dowel. I've just cut this one in half. It was a long full length one, and I've just snipped it. I'm going to cut that to the length I need. You can make these as big or small as you like. I've done them quite large. You want them to sort of stand out a bit, I think. And then we're just going to bend that into an S shape, into a curve. And I'm going to pop a dowel into the centre of this. Give it a wiggle. Kind of want it to go about sort of not quite half the way up. And then you can just mould that into the correct shape. And I've got here a designer wheel tool, and I'm using the flat round end just to score some marks into this. And we'll dust those up later so they look quite dark and almost a bit gnarly. Okay, and we're just going to pop that aside to dry. For the ones on the side of the head, you want a slightly smaller ball of modelling paste. And we do these in exactly the same way, but we're going to bend them into a sort of a C shape rather than an S. So again, you want sort of a tapered cone, sausage shape. Flatten the end off. Make sure it mirrors your other one. And for this one, I'm going to use a cake pop stick here. They're just like clear plastic tubes, or blue plastic tubes in this case. They're really great for supporting these. The big dowels are a little large for the slightly smaller horns. I'm actually just going to snip the end off that because it's a bit long. And again, I'm just going to mark that with my tool. Okay, and that one can be set aside now. For the slightly smaller ones on top, we're going to use exactly the same technique again, but these are going to be sort of much more straight. You can kind of add as many or as little as you want for these horns. I've got 3 large ones in the centre of my dragon here, and then I've got about 8 or so slightly smaller ones for the top. These little ones later will make out of excess sugar paste, so they're much softer and you can eat those ones. I would recommend taking these out of the cake before you cut it and serve it. So as you can see, I've just rolled another little tiny sausage just into a little cone, which is perfect for these little ones here. I'm not going to mark those, I'll just dust them up later. And then for the longer, bigger ones on the front, roll your sausage. I've trimmed off the end. I'm actually going to flatten the ends of these slightly because they're going to sit backwards on the cake. If you leave them like that, they have a big lump on the front and it doesn't look like they sort of slot into his head. So I'm going to pinch that with the end of my finger and thumb. I'm going to turn it over, take one of my cake pop sticks. I'm just going to pop it in the back, running up straight here. And then that way, that will sort of slot nicely down into my cake later. I'm going to mark these ones. Okay, and once you're happy that you've made enough horns for your dragon, set them aside and leave them to dry overnight so they're really nice and firm for when we put them on the cake. Okay, The next thing we're going to do is carve our cake. So I'm going to clear down and set up for that now. Okay, so now it's time to start carving our cake. You can see here that I've got a round cake here which I've baked in a Pyrex bowl. These are all just Madeira cakes. I baked it quite high so that it comes out nice, big and domed. And then I've got two 7-inch round cakes here. One is quite shallow, which I've levelled the top off of, and the other one is quite nice and deep, and I've left the top of it on because that dome will come in really handy when we're sort of carving the nose in a moment. But I have split it in half so that you can put buttercream and jam in it if you wish. So the first thing to do is to stack your domed cake onto your 7-inch round, the shallow one, because that just needs to be the highest point of our head. And then this one's going to sit on the front for the nose. So I'm going to trim round this one and take off the excess. So I've pushed it quite forward, if you can see, to the front of that cake so it lines up. And I'm just going to trim the bit off the back. If you wanted to, you could use a slightly smaller 6-inch cake for this and it would fit quite neatly. But as I already had the 7-inch tin handy for this one, it kind of makes sense just to keep it all to the same. Hang on to your offcuts because these are really handy for also building up the front of the face in a moment. Okay, so once you've trimmed that one round, we're going to add this one to the front. Now, this has got quite a curve on it, so I'm going to take my Pyrex bowl that I baked it in, and I'm actually going to just mark on here a little section that I can cut off so that it sits flush against the face. So I'm actually going to turn it round because this bit here is a bit more lower, and I'm just going to, if you can see that there, just going to mark on here where to cut that. You only want to take a smaller piece off, it's just so that it sits nice and flush. And then with your knife, you can sort of see that. Again, hold on to those nice big offcuts. Okay, so you should have a nice curve cut out of your cake. Then what you can do is slide this in here, and what I'll do is I'll put a bit of buttercream on that to sort of seal it together. So I'm going to fill the inside of my cake now with some buttercream. You can put whatever filling you like in. Obviously, if you've done chocolate cake, you can do chocolate buttercream. You can add jam, all sorts of things. Okay, so that's that one. Just stack that on there and sandwich it together. Then this one here I'm going to take apart. I'm going to put buttercream in this sort of big central area here. I am going to leave the edges blank because we are going to cut those away. But it's easier to fill this with your buttercream and then carve the sides down than it is trying to lift it off and fill it in a moment. And then on the inside of here, or the inside of here, it doesn't matter, pop a bit of buttercream. And sandwich that together. Okay, so that started to make the basic shape for our head. Under my counter here, I'm just going to pull this up. I've got a very thin cake board, which I have I've marked out with the template for my Pyrex bowl, and then just a long strip. It's just going to sit underneath the head of my dragon here, just to give it something to support it when we lift it later. It doesn't have to be exact, it's just got to fit underneath so that you can put your palette knife on and lift it. Just makes things a lot easier. So I'm just going to pop a bit of buttercream on this. Don't need much, and I'm just going to put my cake on top of it. You want to line up your head so it sits on the round bit. Okay. Lovely. And now we can start to carve down the shape of the nose. I'm just going to take my knife and we're just going to carve down the side so we kind of make a long sort of shape for this. You want the front of it to kind of come level with the side of the head, the back of it, sorry. And we're gonna, what we can do is we can use some little pieces that we had cut off earlier to build up the top of the face here so that it sits evenly. So if we start by carving those down. And then you can use the curve of the top of that cake that we left on earlier, just neaten it up. But that's brilliant because it forms that nice curved part to the top of his face. Okay, you want this bit up here to be slightly higher than the front. We're going to build the nose up later with a bit of sugar paste before we cover the cake. I'm just going to carve slightly in at the sides. Give his face a little bit more definition. Not much, just a little. Okay, let's clear away some of this. Let's move that back. If I slide that forward, show you what I'm doing. I'm going to take some of those offcuts that we had earlier. This piece is great. And I'm going to level it off slightly. In fact, actually, I'm going to use this piece from around the side. And I'm going to pop that here, and I'm going to carve it so that we get a nice smooth line from the head to the nose there. So I'm going to trim it down, see which way it fits best. Definitely the other way. And I'm just going to use it Don't worry if it does look a little bit higgledy-piggledy right now. When we cover it in buttercream, it'll smooth it all over and finish it off nicely. Okay, so pop a little bit of buttercream underneath that bit. You will get quite messy making this cake. If you think this is messy now, just you wait till we get the dusts out. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the whole cake in a nice layer of buttercream. Just going to remove some of this to the side. Okay, now that's all covered in a nice layer of buttercream, I'm going to pop that in the fridge and let it chill. And when we come back, we will look at icing it and covering the cake. Okay, so my cake's out the fridge where it's been chilling nicely for about an hour. I'm just going to start building up some of his features, so his nose, and I'm going to build up some bits of his head as well. To do that, I've just got some white icing, sugar paste. I'm going to take a ball for the front of his nose. I'm going to do one on either side for this, and I'm just going to flatten it out slightly. So it's nice and flat on the edges, but it's got a nice big dome in the middle. And I'm going to put that straight onto his face. Now, as your buttercream warms up at the room temperature, it should be able to stick to this nicely. So I'm going to put one there, and I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side. Okay, and I'm going to press those onto the cake. I've got a bone tool here, which I'm just going to take and I'm going to indent in here. So we're kind of forming some nostrils. You want a nice big indent there. Make it slightly shallower at the front. Same again on this side. And you can just press those flat to the cake. So you've built up this kind of big curve here. That's it. Like so. And then for the top of his head, I'm just going to make 2 sausages and I'm going to run them just at the top of his head so that we've got something to kind of build upon in a minute. We're going to put all our little tiny spikes on those. They don't have to be huge, you just want something just to raise it slightly, because don't forget when we cover it with the sugar paste, it'll build upon that again. And they're just going to run down the top of his head. You can pull them into a bit of a curve like I've done there. Okay. Just flatten the ends so that they sit flush to the cake. Okay, I'm going to move that to one side now, and I'm going to start to roll out my icing for my dragon's head. I'm using a grey icing here. I've actually mixed it using a grey sugar paste and a white sugar paste, so I've got a paler shade. The reason I'm using grey rather than white, although we're going to dust it later, is just that it gives you a good base colour. If you were to do this on a white cake and then try and dust it grey and black, you would be there for years. So, I'm just going to dust my surface. I'm going to roll this out. I've got about sort of 1.5 kilos of sugar paste here. It's handy to have the extra because we are going to make little horns with it later. You might be able to see some stripes in my icing actually where I've not quite kneaded it in together. Don't worry if you do have that, because obviously we're going to dust it, so it'll all add to the effect later. I've left it fairly thick. I haven't rolled this too thin because we are going to sort of manipulate it a bit later once it's on the cake. We're going to mark into it and carve bits. So you don't want it too thin, about sort of 3-4 millimetres. So I'm going to roll that onto my rolling pin. And I'm going to bring in my cake. Give it a wiggle so it's not stuck. That's it. And roll that and lay it over your cake. then you can start to work your way around the cake, ironing out any of those creases. Start from the top. Obviously don't push too hard on these bits that are sugar paste because they're still quite soft. What you can see there though is I've just run my fingers in that little dent in the nose, and I'm going to pull my sugar paste out and just sort of cuddle it in, sort of cushion it around the cake. Okay, just sort of rubbing and pressing so you don't get any creases in your icing. You can see where that little bit of sugar paste we put on the top here. You might also notice that I've put my cake onto another hardboard here, just onto another thin cake drum. That's just to make it easier to move around. We're going to do the board last on this cake because we don't want to get the grey dust from your dragon onto your nice sort of white and blue board. So I've put it on a separate one so that I can move it around and I can finish decorating the cake, and then we can lift it off and put it onto our iced board later. Okay. Just sort of using my fingers here just to make this quite a pointy ridge, like so. You can just see, that's it. Give it a more angled effect, angular. Make sure the nose is nice and built up. Okay, and once you're done with that, we can start to cut around the edge of our cake. I'm just going to use a palette knife to take off a lot of this excess first. And I'm going to put that to one side because we're going to make pieces with it later. I'm just going to use this little cutting wheel to start cutting away any of the smaller bits of sugar paste left around the bottom. And again, just rub with your hands. As you can see, I'm not using a smoother or anything for this cake because we are going to build a lot of it up later. That edge isn't going to show. It's going to be quite tucked away. I think because of the shape of it, it's quite difficult to get your smoother in and around it without creating marks. So I'm actually just using my hand here and my little cutting wheel. Okay, that's your cake covered nicely. The only other thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to take a small rolling pin and I'm going to mark out where the large horns are going to go. Now, the really big ones sit sort of just to the side at the top of the head here, and then the others sit just below it at the side of the head. So I'm going to take my rolling pin and I'm just going to use the end of it just to sort of indent where they're going to sit. And kind of give it a nice, just makes it easier, it's got something to sit in then. So you obviously want to make them slightly wider than the actual horns are going to be. Same again on this side. The great thing about this cake is that because he is sort of like quite a haggard looking dragon, we can kind of, nothing has to be exact. You can kind of play around with it. If you do get any holes in your sugar paste, for example, or any cracks, it doesn't matter so much because it kind of adds to the effect of it. Okay, so once those are done, the only thing left to do on this now is I'm just going to add a texture to him, to sort of give him that sort of lizardy-like look. I'm going to use one of these texture sheets here. This is actually a fish scale, but it's brilliant for adding a bit of texture to his face. I'm going to kind of do this all over, a little bit higgledy-piggledy, because he is supposed to be sort of quite an old-looking dragon. So I'm just going to take my texture sheet and just press it on with my fingers, like so. And you can kind of do that, working your way around the cake. I mean, if you don't have one of these, it's not essential. It just adds a little bit extra. You could use a knife and just sort of score across the top. It's just something to sort of almost like rough the texture of your dragon up with. Okay. It's getting heavy now. Okay. We can set that aside. And the next thing to do is start to dust our horns that we made earlier and our cake. I'm going to clear down completely for that, and we're going to set up a nice sheet of greaseproof so it doesn't make too much mess. Now to the dusting. As you can see, I've laid down a sheet of greaseproof paper here, and I'm also wearing some latex gloves. Regular household rubber gloves would be fine. It's just something to protect your hands because this stuff gets everywhere. I've got here on a piece of tissue, I've got some black and some white florist dusts, and I'm going to use a mix of those just to dust the horns up, and then we're going to dust the whole of the head. We will have to go back to the head later and touch it up once we've put all the little horns and the nose details on. So I'll move this in a bit. I'm going to take a small, sort of a medium, sort of small paintbrush here. I'm just going to mix a bit of my white and my black dust together. And I'm going to just start to brush it on to my horns. As you can see, I've got some here that I've done earlier. I'm going to use the slightly darker shades in the black in those little grooves that we made to sort of give them a bit of depth. But the whole thing's going to be covered in sort of a greyish black dust. You may also wish to wear a dust mask when you do this, especially if you're going to sit and do the whole lot in one go, because it does get up your nose. Okay, so in that groove, I've just got a bit of black on my brush here. I'm just going to brush right in that groove with it. Again, you don't have to be too precise with this. He is supposed to look a bit dirty and a bit battered. So we're kind of working from light to dark, really. The bottom of your horn should be darker and the top should be a bit lighter. I mean, you may decide you want to do a red or a purple dragon, and obviously you just change your dusts accordingly. So instead of using greys and blacks, you'd use sort of aubergines and purples. So once you're happy with the colour of that, set them to one side. I'm just going to show you one of these little horns that are going to go on the top of his head later. As I haven't marked these like we did these, so. But again, you can kind of use the same sort of principle. So just use your darker dusts just to draw your lines on, really. So I'm going to give it a sort of a bit of a coat of the grey. like so. Oop. And these are some I've done earlier as well. These ones have got the grooves in. Do that to all of your horns and then put them aside. I'm going to show you how to do the same thing on the cake now. I'm going to use a bigger brush for this. I've got a really big, wide, soft brush actually. And using the same colours, I'm just going to mix a bit of this together. Okay, and I'm just lightly dusting that on. This is just to give it kind of a base coat really. We will go back later once we put all our horns on and we'll make it a bit dark around the horns, add a bit more black. There's no real technique to this bit. You just kind of want it, don't want it all one colour, you kind of want it a bit mottled, a little bit patchy. Try and get in the darker bits in the crevices, and then use your whiter bits for the tips of your nose and the tips of the head. Okay, while I'm working on the front here, I'm going to take a slightly smaller paintbrush to do the inside of the nose. We are going to do that quite dark, so I've just got some black on my paintbrush there. I'm just going to dust it in. So he's got that really dark sort of black nostrils. Same on the other side. You will get through quite a lot of dust doing it this way. I'm also going to take the end of my paintbrush right now, just this sort of medium-sized one, and I'm going to kind of mark out a mouth. We'll dust this later with a slightly darker red. But I'm going to do that now while my sugar paste is still sort of a little bit soft from earlier. Doesn't have to be too much. Just want a little on the front of my mouth. Kind of divide between the upper and the top, the upper and the lower of his mouth. Okay, that should do. Okay, once you're happy with that, and you've sort of dusted it as best you think you can, and as well as you can, or as bad as you can, we're going to move on next. I'm going to clear down first, and we're going to move on to making some of the little smaller horns, and adding the kind of spiny sort of fur almost. Okay. So now we can start adding the horns and the detail to the face of our dragon. I'm going to build up the nose a bit more. I'm going to kind of give it like a spiky finish. To do that, I'm just going to move these across. I'm going to take a ball of icing. This is just leftover sugar paste that we used earlier. I'm going to roll it into a sausage, and I'm going to taper the end slightly. I'm going to flatten it down a little bit. And then using a tiny palette knife, I'm going to cut into it. So I'm going to cut all the way along. Then I'm going to pick it up, and I'm going to kind of just squeeze the ends of those points. Like so. Then using a little bit of edible glue, we're going to run that along his nose. So just along that high bit that we had here. Now we want them to kind of splay out a bit. So just like so. Okay, and I'm going to do the same on the opposite side. Again, ball of sugar paste. I'm gonna move that one up a little bit actually. You will probably get some of the dust from your cake on your hands at this point. Don't worry, it will get on your icing, but again, we're going to dust this up later. So any dust you do get on your clean grey icing will eventually be covered. So this one we're going to do the opposite way. Again, just sort of pull those out a bit. A little bit of glue on his nose. And we're just going to stick that along. Okay. Get that in position. Okay, once you're happy with those, we can move on to his eye. I'm just going to do the top sort of brow of his eye at the moment. We'll add the bottom one on later when we put the eyeball in. So again, we want a sort of a sausage of ball of icing rolled into a sausage. Probably not quite as big for this one. Going to run a bit of glue on the cake where we want it to sit. You want his eyes to kind of sit in the dent just at the side of his head where it kind of narrows here. So we're just going to paint that on there. And then his eye can sit just like so. Press that one slightly against the cake. I've got my texture sheet here. I'm not going to do it on the nostrils because they're quite delicate, but I am going to do it. I'm just going to press onto that just lightly to give that bit of texture. Same again on the opposite side. Okay. Again with my texture sheet. Right, once you're happy with those, we can move on. I'm going to start putting the horns on his head now. I'm going to start with some of the ones we made earlier. I've got 3 sort of very similar ones here. I'm going to start with the 2. We're going to put 2 in and then we're going to put 1 in front of it. We're going to work down and then work back from that. So I've got a tube here that's full of royal icing ready to use later for the spiny bits. I'm just going to use a little bit of that and I'm going to pop it just on the back of his horn. And we're going to slide that into his head. Like so. And that kind of just wants to sit just at the back of where his eyebrow is. Same again with the other one. I mean, they don't have to line up exactly. And then again, one more here. I'm going to put this one just in front of that. So it'll sit sort of here. Okay. I'm going to take my largest one of my sort of freestanding horns. And I'm going to pop a bit of royal icing on the bottom of that. And that's going to sit just on the front in the middle of his head. If you do get any of your royal icing sort of peeking out from the bottom, don't worry, you can just use a paintbrush, wipe it away, and then we're going to dust the bottoms of these later, so they will sort of, you won't notice it. And then some of these on the back. just going to put a little one in here. And these ones here are just going to sit to the side of the ones we did earlier. I'll show you this one from this side. So we're just sort of filling up that gap in the middle of his head at the moment. Here we go. As you can see, I've got a little bit of royal icing on there. Just going to wipe it away with my paintbrush. There we go. I've got a piece of damp tissue here, which I'm keeping my piping nozzle in, because this is royal icing in this tube. We want to keep the end of it wet so that it doesn't dry up and prevent us from piping with it. Okay. Last few of these sort of ready-made horns on the back here. Squish them in. Oh, one more. We're not going to put the large horns on until much later. You kind of don't want to put those on until you're ready to serve your cake or give your cake as a gift, especially if you're travelling with it, because they may they're quite heavy. They may drag the cake. Okay, that's my royal icing done for the moment. As you can see here, I've got quite a few sort of little rolled kind of cones of icing. These are going to make the horns that fill up the side of the face. These are made just out of regular sugar paste, the leftovers that we had earlier, and I'm going to attach those using some edible glue. I'm just going to sort of fill up any spaces around the head. We're just going to sort of press those in place. Obviously these are a different colour grey, we will dust these later, but these need to be put on soft and then left to dry, and then once they're dry we can dust them. Okay, this is really handy actually if your cake's not quite even, which it can be sometimes when you carve your cake freehand, for you to sort of fill in any gap, kind of make it even by just sort of filling up that area with the horns. It kind of detracts from the wonkiness of your cake then. Just adding them in where I feel necessary. I'm going to roll some little tiny ones now. Can you use that? Trying to get stuck to my fingers. Just using the end of my paintbrush here just to sort of push the ones in place that are a bit tight for my fingers to get to there. Okay, now that I've filled the front of his head up with the horns, I'm going to take my bag of royal icing. The nozzle I've got in here is a PME tube, and it's a number 8 star tube. Actually, it might be a rope tube. It's got quite a few sort of little spikes on it. It's brilliant for this. We're just going to sort of pipe. I'll show you on the board. I'm going to pipe and just stop piping and pull away. So we get lots of little sort of horny spikes, and I'm going to kind of cover his head just sort of here, there and everywhere with these. So I'm going to start at the front of his horns and I'm going to work around the cake. Because these sit backwards, you kind of want to start at the back and work towards the front, and you can kind of add them in where you want to. If you've got any gaps on your cake that you think kind of could use some little details, this is great for that. can add some in between the horns up here. And again, these don't have to be perfect. They can sort of look a little bit sort of broken and almost a bit rustic, really. And then round the side of his head, you want to leave a gap where your mouth is going to be, because we're going to put the teeth in here, but I am going to run some just in a little line at the bottom of his head, sort of along here. She says. Like so. You can add them in little clusters if you like, or just separately. And then when we dust the horns that we've attached to the face, we will dust over these as well, give them sort of a bit of depth. Kind of filling up the bottom of the head here, but I'm kind of leaving a little tiny gap where the board meets the cake, because when we lift the cake later, we don't want to really break any of these. So you kind of need to leave yourself a little bit of room to avoid any breaking. Okay, now I'm going to leave that to dry now, probably for about 45 minutes to an hour is best. Any sooner than that, you'll when you start to dust, you'll catch your icing and it won't be dry underneath. I mean, the longer you can leave it, the better. Because it's quite small, it does dry fairly quickly. Just a delicate hand when we come to dusting later. Right. I've got here some more dust. As you can see, I've reset up my area, covered everything with greaseproof. I've got some burgundy dust here, just a little one here. And I'm just going to run that round that crease of the mouth. It doesn't have to be perfect. You just need to kind of give that ready kind of look. Right, that's your mouth dusted. Just means that when you put your teeth on, it's kind of got something behind it in case there's any little gaps. Now, I've got much more black this time than I do the white. I'm just going to pop a little bit in. And we're going to start working across some of these little royal icing patches that we did earlier. Sort of switch between using your large paintbrush and a smaller one. You just want to sort of dust the ends of those little royal icing stars and just sort of blend them in to the cake. So you'll end up with lots of little dark patches. Right, so once you're happy with those sort of scales on that dragon, you can start to dust your nostrils and your smaller horns on the head. Just going to use a small paintbrush for this, using the same dusts. Just want to kind of get in and out of those little crevices. I'm going to get it nice and sort of dark in that curve underneath the hairs on his nostril. Quite dark. Kind of almost looks like he's been a little bit charred. Okay, I'm going to start working on the horns now. And I'm going to go around the bottoms in quite dark in the black. Kind of work up with a bit of the grey. Okay. Right. I'm fairly happy with how that's looking now. So I'm going to stop dusting now. I'm just going to take my large dusting brush and just brush over where I have been dusting, just to remove any loose powder, because there will always be a few bits. Like so. And then I'm going to completely clear down, because the next thing we're going to start working on is the teeth. And obviously they're white, so we need this to be nice and clean. Otherwise you're going to have very sort of patchy looking teeth. Okay, so now to start making the teeth like we have on this one. To do this, I'm going to roll lots of little spikes, a bit like we did for the horns, but we're going to do this in white and on a smaller scale. These are really easy to do. I've got my bone tool back again, which I'm just going to use to sort of indent my cake. We're going to alternate top and bottom. We've rolled our little cones out. I'm using a modelling paste here just because it sets a little bit harder. Put a little bit of glue in there, and I'm just going to run the glue in a line down the cake. Actually, I'm going to use the smaller one for this. I'm just going to push that in so the top of it sits in that little dent, and push it flat against the cake. I'm going to sort of start off smaller, and I'm going to get bigger as I get to the front. Bit of glue. This time we're going upwards. Kind of leave a little tiny gap between each tooth. Trying to keep my hands as clean as possible while we do this. Okay. That's your teeth. So now we can start working on the eyes. For that, I've got a ball of blue modelling paste here. I've coloured this up with some ice blue paste colour. You don't need very much at all for these. It's a bit deceptive. They look quite big, but you want a very sort of almost flat piece of sugar paste. So I'm just going to, probably even less than that. Just going to squish it between my thumb and fingers. And we're trying to work this out into sort of almost an oval shape. So you kind of want to sort of taper the corners in. And then I'm just going to run my fingers around the edge and kind of flatten them out, the edge out slightly, so that it kind of looks like it's curved. Okay, this one. Now I'm going to attach these with a little bit of edible glue, and they're going to sit right underneath that arch there, and we're going to make another arch to sit around the bottom in a moment. Okay, now I'm going to push those in place. Like so. And the same again on the opposite side. Like so. Right. For the underside of the eye, I've got some of the grey sugar paste that we used earlier. And as we did for the top, we're just going to roll a sausage for the bottom. To sort of taper that at the ends. It's going to join up at the front and come round to the back here. Push that in. I've got my little template handy again, just to run along the edge of that. And on this side. That. Now I'm going to paint the details onto the eye, and using that, to do that I'm going to use some dusts, some food dusts here. I've got 3 different colours. I've got the white which we used earlier, I've got an ice blue, and I've also got an ocean blue. And I'm going to use the ocean blue to do the centre of the eye, and then the white and the light blue to sort of do the details to the iris. So I'm going to turn these into paints using the Rejuvenator Spirit. I'm going to start with the dark blue in the centre, and we're going to kind of paint like a pointed oval. So I'm going to start at the top. then we're going to start using the next blue. I'm actually going to add a little bit of white to this because it is quite dark. And I'm just going to use my brush sort of on the side, and we're going to sort of almost flick it so that we get that nice sort of drag mark. You want your brush to kind of be quite dry. Just sort of build it up with the different shades of blue and white. And same again on the opposite side. Okay, I'm just going to clean my paintbrush off. And then I'm just going to use the bit of white just to run round that, that centre of the eye. And that's your eyes done there. I'm now just going to colour these bits, dust them up like we did the rest of the cake, just to finish that last little bit off. I'm going to bring back up my little tissue full of dust, and I'm just going to hold a tissue underneath this, and we're just going to dust along there, just so that we don't get the teeth all black and dusty. Okay, that's one side. Okay. Right. Now that the head is almost complete, we can start working on our cake board next. Okay, so for our board, we're going to build it up using some sugar paste, a bit like we did for the nose on our dragon earlier. I'm going to stick some bits of sugar paste to the board in various sort of different places. We want to do this round the edge because don't forget our dragon head is going to fit in the middle here. And I'm just going to squish those down a bit. And these are going to kind of form sort of mounds for where the ice is going to break. Okay, so I'm just going to run my fingers and squeeze those in a bit to kind of make sort of quite jagged sort of shapes. Like so. Okay, I'm going to move that over for a second. And I'm going to roll out my icing for my board. And now I've got probably about 1 kilo here of icing taken out. Obviously, there was a little bit more taken out for the board. And I've added some ice blue food colouring to this, just to give it that sort of watery look. So I'm dusting my surface down with icing sugar. I'm going to roll this out. You want to roll this out so it's actually just a bit bigger than your board, because we're going to manipulate the sugar paste in a minute, once we get it on the board, to kind of make some more of those sort of dents and cracks. Okay. Just going to bring my board back in. I'm going to lay the sugar paste over the top. I'm going to flatten it out in the middle a bit. And I'm actually going to put my cake onto my board at this point, because we want to put the cake on and then we can move all the icing around it and create that sort of really rocky look to it. Now this is the tricky bit. And this is where it comes in really handy if you put that board underneath your cake like we did earlier. Make sure you can lift that off the board. Lovely. Get my palette knife right underneath. Ooh. Brush those bits away. Okay. So now that you're on your board, you can start to move your sugar paste around. As you can see, I've made a little dent in the front there. So all I'm going to do, take my clean paintbrush, dust away any extra crumbs. And I'm going to take my sugar paste and I'm just going to push it up around that gap, squeeze it in a bit. And we're going to do this around the whole of the board, kind of giving it lots of dents and rivets all the way along. And work in where those little bits of icing that we put underneath the board were. It might look a mess to start with, but by the time we get to the end, you'll get a really good effect. So it's the one time you don't have to ice your board nice and perfectly smooth. So use your fingers, lift your icing, wiggle it in. So I'm just pinching these bits of icing here that I've lifted up. And then manipulating those bits underneath. Okay. Once you're happy with all the dents and the creases you've made on your board, I'm going to take a few of my tools. I'm going to use a palette knife for this, and I'm going to kind of cut into some of those larger ones, those larger the mounds, kind of quite jagged. Kind of want to just push some of the sugar paste back. Probably trim off some of your excess now as well. Leave a little bit just so that anything you do doesn't pull it back, because sometimes if you cut your icing off and then do something, it shrinks up a little. Okay, and then I'm going to take my my wheel that we had earlier, and I'm just going to score along in sort of zigzags to make it look like there's cracks in the ice. Right, now that you're happy with any marks you've made, I'm going to push down around the edge of my cake board and I'm going to trim off that icing. But I'm going to push the edge down so it kind of is quite rounded. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some blue dust. I'm using the ocean blue that we used earlier, just quite a dark blue. And I'm just going to dust around the edge of the head and then in these creases and cracks. Okay, so just check over, make sure there's no bits you've missed. And once you're happy with that, we can start adding the finishing touches to our cake. Okay, so I'm going to stick the ribbon to my board now. I've already run some double-sided tape all the way around it, which I'm just going to peel off. Lovely. And I'm going to run my ribbon around the edge. Trim off the excess. A little bit of double-sided tape to attach the end. Like so. Okay, I'm now going to go back to that sugar glass that we made earlier, or ice should I say. I'm going to add the horns last because obviously as soon as I touch those I'm going to get grey all over my fingers and you don't want your ice to come out like that. So I've got it on the sheet like we had earlier. That's now completely cooled and I'm going to use the end of my rolling pin and I'm just going to crack it down in the middle and hopefully we'll get lots of shards. Hey, if you can see that there, it's broken it all into lots of little shards and you can take those pieces and we're just going to wedge them into your board. And we're going to go round the edge of our dragon's head. Some nice big pieces. Okay. Just fit them in where you think they look good. You can always break up your bigger pieces into some smaller pieces if you wish. And they just... And use all those little tiny bits as well. You can just scatter those across the board. As they sit in the at room temperature, they will start to go a bit sticky, so they will sort of adhere themselves to your board anyway. Okay, let's give that a spin. Okay, so I think one more little piece in around here, and we're done. Okay, now for the horns. I'm going to take my royal icing and I'm going to pop a little dot in those sort of dents that we created earlier. I'm going to put the little ones in first, I think. Make sure you get them the right way around. We're just going to push those into the cake. Give them a wiggle. And they should settle in place. Same again on the opposite side. You can always take them out and rearrange them if they're not quite in the right place. And then for the larger ones, okay, and that's it. There's your dragon complete.